Welcome, LA Progressive friends and family. I am so happy to have with me today Robert Jensen. And Robert Jensen is a retired professor. He is an emeritus professor in the School of Journalism and Media at the University of Texas at Austin, and a founding board member of the Third Coast Activist Resource Center. He collaborates with the New Perennials Publishing and the New Perennials project at Middlebury College. You can find his work at robertwjensen.org. That's robertwjensen.org. Dick and I first met Robert Jensen when he was doing a book talk in our neighborhood in Los Angeles. We live in Northeast Los Angeles. And he was talking about, I'm trying to remember which book it was, because you've written several. Robert, why don't you go ahead and remind me which book it was?
To
And
be honest, I don't remember either. I just turned 66 and memory is not my strong suit,
I
Sharon.
know, I know what you mean. I think it was, it was The Heart of Whiteness,
Whiteness, yeah.
Confronting Race, Racism, and White Privilege. So
Yeah.
welcome, Robert.
Well, it's great to be with you, Sharon. Thanks.
Thank you. So when I reached out to you, you told me, and which I didn't know, that you had another book out. The title of that book is It's Debatable. And it's debatable. It I guess your goal in writing this is to arm people with definitions and to expand their minds on concepts and of terms that we're using and we hear all the time in social media, in the
Hmm.
political sphere, especially as we as a country are becoming more and more polarized. A lot of these terms have been weaponized, like
Mhm.
CRT, critical race theory,
Mhm.
woke
Yeah.
wokeism. And
Yeah.
so your goal in writing this book, and I won't speak for you. Why don't you tell me why you wrote the book and what is contained, what the chapters are?
Well, you're absolutely correct. I spent the first 10 years of my adult life as a journalist and then after that, a professor. And the longer I taught, the more I realized that it's very important to be clear about definitions, because people argue past each other so often when they are using terms in different ways. And since I spent so much of my time essentially trying to make a complex world clear to 18, 19, 20 year olds, uh, I thought, well, I learned something in that process, so let me see if I can write a book. So the book is really in two parts. The first half is reviewing some of these hot button topics like woke and critical race theory and things like that, and trying to be clear about how we should understand the terms. And then some reflections on how we think and what free speech means in a society like this. That may seem kind of trivial, but how we think, is very important. We always tell people to think for themselves, but in fact, nobody thinks for themselves. We're all part of a collective thinking process. And people say, well, you have to have free speech, but free speech is never a simple question. There are types of speech that harm people, and we do prohibit them in appropriate situations sometimes. So after reflecting on the contemporary, political polarization, as it's often called, and then some thoughts about philosophy and freedom of speech, I go into three specific hot button issues. One is race. The second is the debate over the transgender movement, and the third is the what I would call the multiple cascading ecological crises. And so, I joke that there's something in this book for everybody to hate. Most right-wing people would take issue with my analysis of white supremacy in the US. A lot of people on the left would take issue with the critique of the transgender movement I offer. And pretty much everybody wants to avoid a realistic assessment of our ecological crises. But I'm getting old. I don't have to worry about keeping a job. I don't have to worry, about offending my friends because, quite frankly, I don't have that many left anyway. And I thought, if not somebody like me to take this on, Why? Who would? And so that was the motivation behind the book.
Yeah, so it's interesting that you ask if not somebody like me.
Yeah.
As I was reading your book, this last one, um, I felt that you and I are on the same page on pretty much everything.
Hmm.
And especially as it relates to these definitions and
Yeah.
as it relates to the fact that part of the polarization that we see stems from two very different ways of defining these terms.
Yeah.
But it also stems from, in my opinion, bad faith. There
Yeah.
are people who truly don't really care what the definitions are.
Yeah.
There are people that just love to engage in the nastiness that we see.
Hmm.
Um, the kinds of people who are will read your book in good faith, they will benefit from it.
Yeah.
But those who read it in bad faith, they're just looking for another way to tear down.
Yeah.
So
I think you're absolutely right, and the debate about race is makes that readily evident. Um, it's a complex process of figuring out how to understand race in the United States in 2024. It's not the Jim Crow South. It's not a slave society. It's much more complicated than that. And people can find evidence to back up, almost any position they want. So let's say somebody they tend to be from the conservative side of the fence, say, well, there's no real racism in the U.S. anymore. Well, they can see that, for instance, people of color are in positions that they wouldn't have been in when you and I were born. All sorts of things that indicate racial progress. But we know that the United States remains a deeply white supremacist society. You can see it in the data, in the living realities of people, which is highly racialized, the wealth distribution, all that sort of thing. And you can see it in the experience, if you care enough to pay attention to the experiences of people of color. Sharon, I don't think we have time for this, but if you were to detail every way in the last year you feel you've been treated poorly because you're black, we'd be here all day, obviously. So you mentioned good faith, and I think that's important. I think people of good faith can recognize that the United States has made, you could call it extraordinary progress on race relations. After all, this is a society in which, a significant portion of the population is formerly enslaved, and yet we've won, at least in legal terms, a certain amount of equality. Right? And in good faith, we should recognize the United States has made progress. On the other hand, I don't know anybody who, at least nobody of conscience, who would want to freeze race relations at their current state. We still have deep problems around white supremacy in this country. And both things are true. And I think when both things are true, both things have to be engaged. And that chapter on race tries to do that by taking terms like systemic racism, structural racism, and trying to understand what they mean, looking at the data, looking at people's experiences, and not turning away from the tension, but trying to engage the tension. Again, as you point out, not because we're going to resolve it, but because we might deepen the understanding of people who want to deepen their understanding. And my understanding has deepened dramatically in the years I've been thinking about it, and it continues as, we go forward.
yeah, yeah. My husband is a white man, and yesterday we were interviewed on a talk show,
Hmm.
and the topic of the show was marriage,
Hmm.
um, specifically Black marriage. Is the name of the
Yeah.
show is Black Marriage Monday. But they asked my husband, had he learned a lot being married to me? Had he learned more about racism? And
Hmm.
his answer, I can't quote him verbatim, but he said something to the effect of, uh, before I married Sharon, I had Black friends, I had
Hmm.
a Black best friend, and I did have interactions with Black people. He said, but I understood on an intellectual level
Yeah.
racism. But after marrying Sharon and being with her for a while, I began to get a deeper understanding of the emotional toll that it takes.
Hmm.
And so I say that to say that I appreciate writers like you and like my husband because you're somewhat removed. You don't necessarily have to take the emotional barbs
Hmm.
that I may take. And those emotional barbs at times are debilitating for me.
Yeah.
It's difficult for me to write about my experiences or even to read about them because
Hmm.
it triggers so many painful experiences, memories of painful
Yeah.
experiences. So I do appreciate your writing, and I also appreciate your ability to do an analysis from a somewhat objective perspective. And then, of course, you bring up
Hmm.
the point that being white, what you say is taken, is considered um, more credible.
Sure.
It carries heavier weight than if
Yeah.
I were to say it.
Yeah.
So I would recommend that people read this book, especially if you are reading it in good faith with a true desire to understand these disputes over critical race theory and wokeism and the whole
Yeah.
transgender movement. I
Yeah.
highly recommend it.
If I may, something you said struck me. The day-to-day realities, the emotional weight you carry for being black, and of course we could talk about being female as well. But that's a part of life, that kind of struggle and that pain. And this culture, the dominant culture, recognizes it in some cases. So I'm from the Midwest. I'm from a part of the world that's predominantly white. And in some parts of that world, it's been economically devastated over the last 30, 40 years. Farm country doesn't look the way it used to. Well, in the national conversation, when we talk about white rural people who feel devalued, who've lost economic opportunities, who are dealing with the opioid crisis, we realize that those folks carry a certain emotional weight, a burden. They're looked down on as losers by coastal elites, all sorts of things, and we take that seriously. In other words, the emotional burden of being in that marginalized category, and I think in a lot of ways rural white people are marginalized in parts of this country. Well, that's real. But then when we talk about the daily burden of being black, let's say, a lot of people will say, well, you just need to buck up, get tough. Well, wait now, if the emotional burden of being in a marginalized group is real in one case, it's real in all these cases. And in some sense, this is just a plea to remember we're all human. Everybody has some experience in their life, even very privileged people, when they felt devalued, they felt humiliated. I have a lifetime of that from being a kid who was never, a traditional guy in terms of that culture. And I don't have any trouble remembering what it felt like, to go through my childhood constantly feeling scared, feeling humiliated, feeling less than. Well, there's no reason I can't look at your situation and empathize because I've had the same experience. Right? It doesn't mean everybody's similarly situated. It doesn't mean everybody carries the same burdens. But it's hard to be human in a very oppressive society like the one we live in. And so we should be able to have that empathy. And I think you're exactly right. A lot of people are not open to that empathetic process. They already come in saying, I'm going to make myself feel better by feeling better than somebody else. And that is a recipe for social disaster.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, you're so right. So let's talk about some of these definitions.
Okay.
Now, you've already talked about institutional or structural racism.
Yeah.
In your book, you do a comparison
Yeah.
between the individual
Right.
racist and the structural institute,
Yeah.
and then you even make some distinction between structural,
Yeah.
institutional. So go ahead, I won't.
Yeah. Well, I think when we were talking before the show, we both recognized we're kind of nerdy. We like to read and be precise. So I noticed, I come from the political left, and I noticed that these terms, systemic racism, structural racism, institutional racism, they kind of get thrown around with no common understanding, no clear definition. And I'm not saying that my attempts to define them are definitive, but I was trying to work through, well, what work can these terms do for us? So we all know that that racism can be individual and it can be overt, right? Everybody has bumped into people who are overtly racist, and deeply so. But the great insights, I think, of some of these critical movements is to say racism goes beyond just individuals who overtly express racist ideas or engage in racist acts. So then we get into this notion of unconscious racism, institutional racism, racism that gets replicated even though no individual might wake up in the morning and say, boy, I'm going to support white supremacy today. Okay, well, as I sort of wrestled with those terms, I made a distinction between systemic and structural racism to say systemic racism is the kind of racism that might be present throughout a system. I use the example of public schools, where there might be unconscious attitudes on the part of teachers and administrators that replicate racist practices. So, for instance, there's a lot of data, for instance, that Black children in school are disciplined more heavily and more punitively than white kids. Well, I doubt that's because every teacher wakes up in the morning and said, boy, I'm going to go, bust a Black kid down today. It's about an unconscious attitude based on a whole history of assumptions about people of color and Black people especially. Yet it's systemic. It's not just one person, it's throughout the system because, of course, those assumptions are so widespread. I use the term structural racism to indicate racist realities that are more baked in, you could say. So the example I use, again, talking about schools, is a good chunk of public school funding is based on local property taxes. That means property-rich districts are going to be better funded than property-poor districts. That means people in wealthy neighborhoods are likely going to have better schools than people in less wealthy neighborhoods. Well, since there's a racialized distribution of wealth in this country, that is, white people tend to, on average, of course, not every white person, but on average, to have more assets, and people of color don't, especially Black and brown communities. That means Black and brown schools, where the predominant student body is Black or brown or both, are going to be systematically underfunded. And that's structural. It's baked into the structure of school funding. And you're not going to solve that unless you change the nature of school funding, right? So that school funding becomes equal. And the kids in the rich white suburbs don't have better equipment and better buildings and more instruction and more extracurriculars than the kids in schools without that property base. All right, well, structural racism is not easy to fix. How do you fix school funding in the United States? Right? School funding or school administration is localized, and for good reason. A lot of people believe that the best decisions made about schools are made by people there on the ground, parents and school officials. Well, if you want to have equal school funding, you're probably going to have to centralize a lot of school funding decisions, probably at the federal level. And a lot of people don't like that idea. And so these are real difficult questions when you're talking about structural racism. I don't have answers to them. It's not a glib, here are the 10 steps to undermine structural racism in the United States. If I were that smart, I'd be happy, but I'm not. So that's a somewhat long-winded attempt to explain how in that issue I tried to be clear about definitions.
Well, I think that one of the things that has come out of critical race theory,
Mm-hmm.
and a lot of the studies in academia are these terms,
Yeah.
structural racism, institutional racism, because it is something that's real,
Yeah.
and it helps to provide an answer. Well, let me
Yeah.
give you a specific. I am right now. Yesterday, I spent half the day writing a piece about at-large versus
Mm-hmm.
district races, at-large races
Right.
versus district races in political campaigns. My son happens to be running for political office,
Hmm.
and he's running in a community that up until this month November 2024, they had always conducted at-large city council races, never
Hmm.
city council races that were by district. The city wasn't broken up into
Right.
districts. It was just the entire city would vote for five city council representatives. Well, the California Voting Rights Act requires that city vote by district. However, it's not self-enforcing. And so in order for these cities to actually implement the rules that are established in the California Voting Rights Act, they really have to be forced to. They have to be
Hmm.
challenged in court. And so a lot of cities chose to do this district by district to avoid costly lawsuits. And his city is one of them. But when you talk about, I'm going to get back to challenging structural racism. If you were to go to his city hall in the community where he lives,
Hmm.
and in the city hall, there's a huge wall of all of the leaders of the city since the city was founded. And every single photograph or portrait is of a white man,
Yeah.
except for one picture of a white woman who is currently serving and a picture of an Asian man.
Hmm.
I don't know how many leaders there have been, but let's say that there were 50. Now, for me to walk in and see that, I
Hmm.
personally would say, okay, I'm living in an environment where they believe that the leadership has to be white. Well,
Yeah.
by the way, the population is 37% white. The
Yeah.
leadership is 100% white.
Yeah.
So my dream is that one day a white person would walk in and look at that wall and say, we've got a racial problem here.
Sure. Yeah.
And it's a structural problem. It's not individual racists.
Yeah. Absolutely. And it's history and practice. Uh, it's the way that the rules can be massaged to benefit one group over another. Let me give you an example of, some people say, well, this, the real racism is in the past. Get over it. I'm sure you've heard that your whole life. When
Mhm.
I moved to Austin, Texas, in 1992, there were five at-large city council members, and there was what was called the gentleman's agreement that there would be one black and one Hispanic member. And of course, those were essentially people chosen by the power structure. That didn't change until, I don't know, a little more than a decade ago. Right? So we're not talking about some ancient history. We're talking about practices that remained in place. And of course, some people want them to remain in place. Let me, old people tend to just ramble on and tell stories, but let me tell you one more. In the 2016 presidential election, I got a call from a student at the business school at the University of Texas. Business school tends to be more conservative than other parts of the campus. And he said, I'm putting on a program about the presidential race and the politics around it. And I said, what's your motivation? He said, I'm scared by how many of my fellow students are verbally, aggressively pro-Trump. They're walking around, with their fist in the air about Trump. And this person, who was of Indian descent, said, it scares the hell out of me. And so we had an interesting panel. And at the end of it, he was right. Most of the audience was dyed-in-the-wool Republican, and a surprising number of them were very supportive of Donald Trump, surprising to me. That's how naive I was. And at the end of the session, I said, listen, in the state of Texas, if you're a Republican, you have bet your future on two things: extreme gerrymandering and voter suppression, right? That the Republican Party clearly has a strategy of gerrymandering its way to power. It's been doing it for decades, and it is engaged in active attempts at voter suppression. And I said, if you're comfortable with that, then go ahead and endorse that party proposal. And I thought, well, that's going to make them think. And I looked out at the audience and saw a bunch of young people, almost entirely white, smiling, like, yeah, we got a strategy: voter suppression and gerrymandering. And I thought, wow, I really have been overestimating the good faith of that wing of the American electorate. Now, some people would say, well, you're being divisive. And I don't think that's being divisive. I think that's being honest about the landscape on which we have to operate. And it's, a version of the story you tell about that city in California. And everywhere you go in the United States, you will find that. right?
That's right.
And it's a problem that we either wrestle with or we continue to try to bury. And of course, if those of us with, let's call them liberal leanings, bury it, then the overt white supremacists will simply grow in strength.
That's right. And so I am often thinking that the reason that we haven't put this issue to bed
Yeah.
is because the negative impact to the rest of America
Mm-hmm.
hasn't been hasn't always been apparent.
Yeah.
But there is a negative impact to the rest of America, which is the
Mm.
reason why we do the LA Progressive, why we have these
Yeah.
conversations. I personally don't believe it's possible for us to come together as a nation,
Yeah.
unite, and come up against the forces that don't care about our environment, that
Yeah.
don't care about education or healthcare. All of us need these things,
Yeah.
but we can't seem to come together and demand them because of the deeply divided racial issues.
Yeah. That's so. Again, you're right on target, I think, and it made me think of an experience in my own life. So bear with me again as I ramble a bit. There's for people in positions of privilege and power like me, I think there's always an argument from justice that we should make the world right, right? But there's also an argument from self-interest, as you're pointing out. And this really hit home to me. I started doing some volunteer editing with a prison writing program. It happens to be a prison in Washington State. And I worked most closely with two young men, younger than me. One has a life without parole sentence, and the other one a 63-year sentence, which is essentially a life sentence. And a shout out here to Antoine and Daryl. I so love working with these guys. But the potential that was lost to the community, the expense of corralling and incarcerating not just these two gentlemen, but whole populations, the waste of life that is the problem of differential policing and prisons. It's extraordinary, and I knew that. To harken back to another point you made, I knew that intellectually. I read Michelle. This is another
Alexander.
Andrew. Thank you, Michelle Alexander's book. I keep up on this, but it was the interaction with these two men, Daryl and Antoine, that really drove home the tragedy. And it's not just a tragedy for them, for their families, for their communities. It's a tragedy for the whole society that dumps extraordinary resources into punitive policing and prison systems that make no one safer and undermine a flourishing community. And I, we have to be able to feel that.
Yeah.
It's not just an intellectual process. It's knowing that. And I think that's what changes people. At least it's what changed me over my life as I tried to wrestle with these things. Just the sheer insanity of the way we have constructed a profoundly unequal society, unequal in terms of race, gender, class, everything, and how it is draining our capacity to be fully human and keeping even those of us with power and privilege from the most flourishing communities we could be part of.
That's right. And I think the only way to have real empathy is to be in relationship,
Yeah,
which is what you've developed with those two
yeah,
young men.
yeah,
The more
yeah,
you develop community and relationship, the more you're able to use that
yeah,
empathy to have a deeper understanding how to be human. Really, it's about how to
yeah,
be human.
yeah,
I we can move on and talk a little bit
yeah.
about chapter 5. Why chapter
Sure.
5 is not in the book,
Yeah.
and I had mentioned to you, I think, before we started
Hmm.
recording, that I was raised in a family with a mom and a dad, but they were very young. They were teenagers.
Hmm.
And my mother's brother, who is my uncle, moved in with us and really helped to raise us.
Hmm.
I have always thought of him as sort of the third parent in the home. And he was gender nonconforming. I speak of him in the past tense. He
Yeah.
died in 1989 during the AIDS crisis. But I loved him dearly, was raised with him and around him and his friends. And when I got old enough to realize that people um, had a problem with
Hmm.
a person's gender, what gender they expressed or what their sexuality was, I couldn't believe it. So,
Yeah.
like you were saying, you
Yeah.
couldn't believe that these kids were supporting Trump and
Yeah.
understand why people would care
Yeah.
who my uncle dated or what kind of clothes he wore.
Yeah.
And so let's talk
Yeah.
about chapter
Yeah.
5.
So my political roots are in the wing of feminism that's typically called radical feminism. Although increasingly I hesitate to use the term because it doesn't have much meaning. It's historical. But I came into this through the feminist critique of pornography, the feminist critique of prostitution, what I call the sexual exploitation industries, the way men routinely buy and sell women's bodies for sexual pleasure. And that wing of feminism argued, still argues today, and I think persuasively, that we will never construct a society with gender justice when one group of people can be bought and sold for the pleasure of another. Okay, that wing of the feminist movement also developed a critique of the transgender movement. Your comment about your uncle reminds me, it's not a critique of people who struggle with gender dysphoria, let's say. It's certainly not a critique of people who are gay or lesbian. The radical feminist wing of the movement that I was part of starting in the late 80s embraced gender nonconforming people. A lot of the folks I first worked with were lesbians who, didn't try to conform to expectations about what it meant to be female. And they did so actively and publicly. Right? So the question for the radical feminist movement wasn't should people defy the gender norms in patriarchy. In other words, these very regressive, repressive, restrictive norms. Right? The norms that when I was growing up as a young child, I was struggling with because I didn't fit the tough guy, image. Well, that wing of feminism has always been supportive of those challenges. The question is, when we start talking about public policy in the transgender movement and the question of, all female spaces, the questions that come up so routinely today, there, the radical feminist movement that I'm part of does have a critique, and I've been articulating that critique for about 10 years now, following the work of some pioneering women. Well, that doesn't go down very well on the left. I'm, again, part of left political movements when I lived in Austin, Texas. And I found that I was often shunned, kicked out of groups. People stopped talking to me. And I think that's a problem. People can disagree, and many people do disagree with me, but we've shut down a conversation about what the transgender movement means by some of the terms it uses and what are the public policy implications of it. And in the end, as I point out in the chapter, in the end, what is best for people suffering with gender dysphoria? That is, people who might be biologically male but feel they belong in the social category of woman. Well, those are complex questions, but the left has pretty much shut down debate about that in left circles, in my experience. And the reason the chapter isn't in the book is that even though the press signed the book and accepted the book with a full manuscript, in the last minute, they got cold feet about including that chapter. So we reached an agreement where there's a notice in the book that you can find that chapter for free on my website. Not the most elegant solution to the problem, but at least the book got published and the chapter is available. So I, again, tried to work with clear definitions and help people understand what's at stake in the debate over the transgender movement.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much, Robert. So let's talk about the third part.
Yeah.
of the book. You broke it down into race, discussions on race, discussions on the transgender movement, and
Yeah.
then what you're calling the ecology,
Yeah.
the ecological sustainability.
Yeah. Here, I find that nobody, right, left, center, wants to really grapple with the way I present the question of, again, what I call the multiple cascading ecological crises. And the reason I use that term is climate change is probably the most serious of these crises and the one that appropriately gets a lot of discussion. But the argument I make in the book, following some very good ecologists over the last few decades, is that the problem isn't really climate change. The problem is what we can call overshoot. Too many people consuming too much beyond the capacity of our ecosystems to manage. Climate change then is a derivative of overshoot. We have a lot of ecological crises. One I've dealt with a lot is soil erosion and soil degradation. Most people don't think much about soil erosion, but the way we do agriculture, especially grain agriculture, the way we grow our staples, wheat, corn, rice, produces extraordinary levels of soil erosion and soil degradation. And of course, without fertile topsoil, there's no food. And that's a real crisis. It kind of flies below the radar for a lot of people. Of course, we have the chemical contamination of the land and our own bodies. Right? We have the biodiversity crisis, the species extinction. And we have climate change, or what is probably better called rapid climate disruption. Okay, all of those are the product of too many people on the planet consuming in the aggregate at too high a level. Now, obviously, I said the aggregate to point out that not everybody in the world consumes equally, obviously, and the question of the distribution of resources is crucial. But I make the point, which is not popular, that the world cannot sustain 8 billion people living at anything like the level we live in modern society. And therefore, we have to not only talk about renewable energy, which I'm a big supporter of, but we have to talk about what I call fewer and less, fewer people consuming less in the aggregate. Well, the right wing doesn't like that because the right wing wants more people, right? And the right wing doesn't want to talk about a reduction in consumption. It wants to expand consumption. But even on the left, I've found that discussions about the population crisis are kind of verboten. A lot of people refuse to even think about it. And that's partly because the discussion of population has kind of an ugly history, a lot of racism, eugenics. But the fact that there's an ugly history to a concern about population doesn't mean it's not a problem. And the left really doesn't want to talk about a reduction in consumption either. If you look, for instance, at the Green New Deal, which has some admirable points, there's no discussion about reducing our consumption. And the fact is that the world can't continue at the level it's currently drawing down the ecological capital of the planet. So my little bumper sticker is we have to strive for fewer and less. Right? Well, Sharon, imagine you're going to run for Congress in your district. Is your party platform going to be, I want to reduce the consumption of my constituents? I can guarantee you that if you implement my proposals, we will all be consuming less energy and less material resources. Well, that's not a winning political strategy. No one on the left really proposes it. And so there's a great silence about what I think is the core questions around ecological sustainability. And that chapter tries to make those coherent.
So how do you do the research for these books and write these books without just feeling depleted?
Well, that's a question I get a lot. And people ask me, where do you find hope? And my answer pretty much is I don't have any hope. Hope is not a really important question for me. I like being alive. I like doing work. I like engaging with friends and family. There's a whole lot about being alive on this planet that I think is quite wonderful and quite joyful. But I can do all of that without having to assert that somehow we're going to magically solve our problems, right? I don't know, maybe I'm just kind of curious psychologically that way, but I don't have trouble holding in my mind both the profound failure of the human species in the modern era and the joy that comes from being a part of that species. I think a lot of it, no doubt, comes from the opportunities I've had. As I said, I spent my entire life, adult life, being either a journalist or a professor, and those are really exciting professions. You get to learn about the world, meet people. Basically, you get paid to talk and write, which is kind of a cushy way to live. And so I've had incredible opportunities to meet people and learn about the world that excite me. But there is a part of me that also deals with what a friend of mine once called the profound sense of grief that is inevitable if you tell the truth about the world. And for whatever reason, I don't have a problem holding that in my mind as I also engage the world. And I think that's the real question, not do you have hope, but when you get up in the morning, do you have useful work that puts you around decent people? If you have useful work that puts you in the company of decent people, it's possible to move forward. And I'm lucky that I do have what I feel is useful work, both in my writing and editing life, as well as taking care of a piece of property in rural New Mexico where I now live, where, by the way, apples are in season. And as soon as we're off this call, I'm going to go pick apples. I live in a community full of people who care about the community and the land. I have longstanding friendships with people from my political life that invigorate me. That's how I do it. And, everybody's got to figure it out their own way. But I often make the point that, Sharon, you and I are going to die someday. Right? And we know that. We've known that as long as we've been conscious. And yet we don't wake up every morning and say, oh, what's the point? We're going to die someday. I might as well stay in bed. Just like I think this civilization, this culture, the modern era is going to die someday. I don't know how it's going to happen or when it's going to happen, but I don't have a lot of hope it's going to go forward. Yet it doesn't mean I think, oh, well, there's nothing to do. Our lives are meaningful when we have a way to contribute to the world. And I think that's the real question. How can we make it easier for people to contribute to the world?
Wow. Well, I think that's a perfect note to close
Yeah.
on. Robert Jensen, it's been a pleasure talking to you, reading your books. People can find your work. Would you tell us
Yeah.
the URL and
Yeah.
any other URLs you'd like to share?
Yeah. The easiest way to find my stuff is just to put my name, Robert Jensen, and you spelled it, which is good because people often misspell it, but Jensen. And my website will be the first one that pops up in Google. And there are articles, even some of my older books that are out of print that are available. And there are links to other projects that I think are important. The problem these days isn't a lack of information. It's trying to figure out how to spend our time learning about the world when we are constantly, facing a flood of information. I've been lucky that in my career I've been able to focus on a variety of topics: sex and sexuality, race, economics, foreign policy. I've been kind of an all-purpose lefty, trying to bring a critical sensibility to all of the major crises that we face. So people will find a lot of resources on my website.
Thanks again,
Great,
Robert. It's
great.
been a pleasure, and I'd like to
Thank
do
you.
it again.
I
So
would,
we'll
I would
stay in
love to.
touch. All
Thank you
right.
so much. Take care.
Thank you. Long. Thank you for sticking around. If you like the LA Progressive content and the discussions we have here, please consider clicking the subscribe button below and also give us a thumbs up. That helps to grow our audience by feeding the algorithm, which helps to get this content in front of more eyes. Thanks for stopping by. We really appreciate your support.